Hi, welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This is the final episode of 2020. This week's topic is cultural incentives, and we have two featured guests joining us to discuss, Erez Yoeli and Bethany Burum. Erez is an economist, and Bethany is a social psychologist, and they work together to try to understand the roots of human social behavior. So the topic, as I said, is cultural incentives. So, a lot of times we talk about the extent to which the economy needs labor to produce output. But does it become a problem if the economy needs less labor? Is it a problem if basic income leaves some people jobless? How adaptable are psychology and culture to these kinds of changes? To what extent do people need to work jobs in order to live meaningful and fulfilling lives? Is it a coincidence that people happen to have a need to do the very thing that society expects of them? So these are kind of the framing questions for our discussion. Some of us read an article from April of 2020 from The Guardian by Laura something. Here we go. Laura Aronati, entitled Experts Warn of Mental Health Fallout from Mass U.S. Unemployment. So I want to start by going to Bethany and then Erez to get initial thoughts. So go ahead, Bethany.
Okay, and I'm going to just share a couple slides since I'm used to teaching, but not much, just to kind of go along with the few opening thoughts that I have. So as Alex was alluding to just now, we think of work as something that fulfills many roles currently in our lives, and not just giving us all of the means of survival, but also some kind of like psychological or purpose oriented role where we need work. Some people think in order to have like a fulfilling life where we have a sense of purpose, we need it to have a sense of status in society. We need it to purportedly to demonstrate like our good character to people. So for example, on the left is this quote, hard work spotlights the character of people. Some turn up their sleeves and some turn up their noses and some don't turn up at all, right? So presumably it's better to be the first one. Orrin Cass, somebody that Alex actually knew as a sort of random side note in high school, wrote this book called The Once and Future Worker, which is all about how important work is to people. And in both of these cases, I don't know for sure about the quote, but in his case, he's talking about paid labor, not just anything that you could do that might be productive. So that's going to be what I'm focused on when I talk about this too. And as Alex mentioned, there was this optional article talking about how not only are people losing their source of income when they lose their job, for example, during the coronavirus, but they're also potentially going to suffer mental health effects. And the implication in this article is that that's above and beyond the loss of income. It's a little unclear whether they demonstrate that or not in the article, but it's implied, I think, that people are going to lose something beyond the income, that even if you just replace the income with stimulus or something like that, that's not enough. And this is a quote from the article. It says, "It may seem cliche, but work is not all about the money, and research proves it." People want to work. They want to do meaningful things. And again, here they're talking about paid labor, so it's a little bit fuzzy what their argument here is with meaningful things, but they're implying that paid work is necessary to sort of feel like you're doing something meaningful. This professor says. But one thing that I do in my work and Erez does in his work is we try to look across different kinds of time periods, different kinds of situations to see if the things that we take for granted actually apply all the time. And as a humorous example, I'll show you a clip that suggests that this view on work is not universal, right? We've in other time periods when the economy worked differently, people felt differently about work. Actually, I may need to share sound for this. Sorry, one second. Here we go. So this clip is courtesy of our coworker that Erez mentioned earlier, Moshe, who's a fan of Downton Abbey.
What will you do with your time?
I've got a job in Ripon. I said I'll start tomorrow.
A job? You do know I mean to involve you in the running of the estate.
Oh, don't worry. There are plenty of hours in the day. And of course I'll have the weekend.
What is a weekend?
So the character at the end there is particularly famous for throwing shade. She probably knows what a weekend is, but she's indicating that it's not maybe such a great thing for somebody at their level to have a job. right? So what's the difference between how we think of work right now in our culture and in Downton Abbey? Well, I think one obvious difference is that we require a job, as Alex was talking about earlier, to get just about everything for well-being in life. We need it just to basically eat, to have shelter, to have healthcare for the most part, not to mention anything more luxurious than that, like being able to take a vacation or having, go to a movie. And then with resources comes access to friends, comes access to people to date, because people don't want usually to date someone who's destitute on the streets as much as they want to date someone with more resources. Same for friends and everything else. So it's hard to overstate the importance of having a job to most people's well-being in our economy. And yet in Downton Abbey, they do other kinds of work, but they don't do paid labor because they're at a sort of a level in society where actually if they were to, the people in that society who do paid labor are actually less well off. They have fewer resources than the people who don't. And lo and behold, the attitude towards paid labor is different. And we've seen this beyond Downton Abbey. We see it in other time periods and in other, I don't know if there are any other places right now, but certainly for women in earlier periods of time as well, even when men were starting to work more universally, it was seen as okay for women to do work that wasn't a paid job. And then that has changed to some degree gradually over time as well. So these attitudes shift. And the overall thesis that I think both Erez and I are going to talk about today is that our morality, our ideologies, our sense of preferences, including what we enjoy, what gives us a sense of purpose, all these things respond to incentives. And to some degree, that means that they can change when incentives change. And this can help us make sense of how attitudes are different in different times and places. So why is any of this relevant to us in a basic income discussion? Well, as I alluded to with that Once and Future Worker book, some people who are concerned about basic income are concerned about the fact that people actually need, they would argue, something like a paid job to have a good quality of life. And sort of, I think implicit in that idea is this idea that there's a fixed human desire to perform paid labor. That this is something that isn't really going to change. People need this, and so our economy needs to accommodate this. And if you hold this view, even if you are a fan of basic income, you're going to have to figure out some way to help people be able to perform paid labor so that they can have a good quality of life. Or if you don't, that'll be some kind of sacrifice. But this alternative view that Erez and I have is that maybe it's not so much that we have this fixed human desire to do paid labor. Maybe we desire doing paid labor because we need to do that in our current economy to have any kind of well-being. Most of us, unless we're born, really wealthy, and lo and behold, somebody born into like inherited wealth may not feel this desire, or they might because they're in our culture. But I'll get to that later. And valuing and enjoying paid work in our economy, it motivates us to do what we need to get resources. And then there's a secondary thing, which is if you are going to your place of work where you're getting these resources and you convey that you really think a work ethic is important and you love working and it's your raison d'etre is to work, you're probably going to seem to be somebody who's going to work harder for the company and get promoted. Whereas if you go in and say like, man, what I really get meaning and purpose from is like being with my family or other things, like I have to do this job to like get money, obviously, but I don't really want to be here. That's not going to help your career prospects as much. So there's also a reason to internalize these beliefs from the perspective of signaling to others that you're going to do what they want you to do, and in exchange you'll get more resources. So I think this is really important to understand, because if our economy were to change substantially, not just with the basic income, but if along with that you had a reduction in the amount of work people had to do, paid labor people had to do for resources, you might see some shift in this proportional to what's changing in the economy, shift in what people actually feel that they want to do and enjoy doing and need to do for meaning and purpose and all of that. So that's my guess, and that's that I will talk about today. There are a few other things. There are many other things, other ways that cultural incentives intersect with basic income, but just a few others that we can talk about. Cultural incentives are also a kind of motivation. So paid labor gives you money to motivate you to do things, but there are other ways that people are motivated to do things. And this is actually something that Erez was talking about a little bit earlier in his introduction. People are often altruistic or give resources away. And one of the kinds of motivations for that, or some of the kinds of motivations for that, might be reputational benefits that they get from other people. So there are these cultural incentives to contribute to society that can supplement or substitute for monetary payment. And this might be relevant when we think about basic income, because one thing we often talk about is how the optimal level of basic income might kind of depend on how much motivation people have to provide benefits without being paid to do the work. And so if people are happy to do like everything we need for them in society without any payment, that would be unlikely. But if they're all the way on that extreme, then the basic income we can give people is higher, because we don't need that extra incentive of paid labor. And if people really don't want to do anything useful without getting paid, it's going to be a different kind of level of basic income that we might be able to afford. So we can talk about that. And then what will people do for meaning and purpose outside of paid labor? Some of that's going to be related to these cultural incentives too. Like people might not show off as much with a paid job to other people, but maybe they'll show off with an unpaid skill that they develop, the way that people even now might become like incredibly good at skateboarding or whatever, and get some social cachet with that for that. So we can talk about these kinds of things as well. And the last sort of food for thought that I'll throw out there for people if they want to get into it is, I've talked about people changing with changing circumstances, but of course people don't change immediately. There's going to be some stickiness because these are things that people have internalized, and that stickiness could be a generation, it could be a year, it could be different for different people, it could be multiple generations. So I think this is an interesting open question, and obviously we need to adapt to the pace at which people's preference for, say, paid labor might shift. So that could be something interesting to talk about as well. So just some different questions to kind of throw out there, but hopefully the key thesis is clear, and I'll keep kind of hammering it home, I'm sure, throughout the discussion. So thanks so much, Alex. I'm excited to get into it.
Okay, thanks, Bethany. Go ahead, Erez.
I don't feel like I have to go anymore. I think
Okay.
we're all set. I came prepared to discuss a little bit of evidence in support of Bethany's argument that I collected mostly out of a single source, which is a book by a anthropologist at Harvard named Joe Henrich, who wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World. And it's fabulous, and everybody should totally check it out if you're looking for some wintertime reading. And so I'll summarize that. Before I do, I want to speak to 2 points that Bethany raised. One is there's actually a great, if you're a fan of the show The Marvelous Miss Maisel, there's a great illustration of the fact that work was initially seen as kind of something that wasn't so desirable amongst women when what's the main character's name in Marge, the star of the
I haven't seen it,
show.
but I've heard it's good.
She's great. I mean, she's great. But when she gets a job for the first time, this is the late 50s, her mother is just horrified. And like the first thing she thinks is, oh my God, what will this say about us as a family? So her mother is definitely somebody who looks a bit like the mother in Downton Abbey and thinks of work as something that's beneath a woman. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight was that this question of pace is one that Henrich's book speaks a lot to. So maybe I'll transition to talking about that, and I'll come back to this question about pace. So Henrich writes this book. It's called The Weirdest People, and the whole premise of the book is that the Catholic Church has some unique set of policies starting in the 3rd century, but really accelerating in the 9th century AD, that restructured society in a really unique way that we hadn't seen in other cultures before. And in particular, what the church did was it broke up the clans. The church sort of viewed itself as having its primary competition were clan-based structures, and these are probably the most common way that you see societies get organized. There's a kinship group, people who are related to each other, kind of work together, and those clans that as they grow and they grow more powerful, they can either take over other clans that are adjacent, or they can grow wealthier through trade and expand their network through trade. If you've ever looked at late medieval, early Renaissance banking, it was these families who would work as a clan together all over the Mediterranean in order to so that they could trust each other enough to loan each other money and actually expect to get paid back. You see the same kind of thing amongst clans in East Asia, where the merchant class is dominated by one or two clans all over Southeast Asia, even like basically till modern times. So that's the traditional structure of society is structured around these clans, and then Henrik finds that, there's this new structure that arises because the church basically wants to bust up the clans and take the resources that the clans are hoarding for themselves for itself. So that's the background that you need, and as a consequence of this, you basically get a society where the family structure shrinks a lot. The church does this through a variety of laws, including banning cousin marriage and things like that. So, in most societies, it's perfectly fine to marry your cousin, but the church makes it so that we think that that's gross. So that happens, and then you get the society starting in around maybe the 11th century, 12th century. When we get to the High Middle Ages in Europe, it's starting to look really different from a society that you saw before. The urbanization rates start to climb astronomically, whereas urbanization rates in other parts of the world are pretty flat. Because people are more mobile, they're not stuck to their clan. They converge on cities, and by the 1350s, you have most cities in Europe have 50% more population than they did at the height of the Roman Empire. So they're doing really, really well. My cat is really insisting on participating in this conversation. I apologize. In addition to that, you have this individualism that starts to grow, and so on. So that's the background. When it comes to basic income, there's two key pieces of evidence that he's assembled related to people's satisfaction with regards to work, the degree to which people's personal identity and the things that they think are right or wrong are actually driven by work. So he actually opens the book with some evidence where he says, if you ask somebody to describe themselves, what will they tell you? And in most societies, they'll tell you, hi, my name is Erez. I'm the son of Amir and the father of Mookie and Pumpkin. In our society, you ask somebody, hi, who are you? And they'll say, I'm a researcher at MIT, like something like that. So most people in our society will identify to some extent, at least, with their profession. But if you look at across societies, that's not the case at all. Most people think about the relationships that they have as being foremost. And he talks about some other things that people associate. So they'll ask people about the way that they perceive themselves, and it differs on other dimensions as well. But for our purposes, the key one that's really interesting is the fact that they even respond with regards to work versus not. So some people view that as a key piece of their identity, some don't. So that's one piece of evidence he provides. A second piece of evidence that he provides relates to, I would say, like starting around 1100, but by 1300s, and certainly by the time that the Reformation happens, there's this movement for work to be associated with godliness. So work becomes virtuous. Hard work becomes associated with God. And the Protestants are the ones who really take this to the next level. So in Protestant culture, most people sort of view themselves as having a calling, and that's God's calling for them. And that calling is typically a profession. And so if you are a good, virtuous person, that's associated with the fact that you work hard at your calling, i.e. your job, which is something you will not find even in Catholics. It was the Catholic Church that kind of started this process, but the Catholics don't really have that same strong association, but in Protestant societies you do. And Henrik proceeds to show that people are sort of voluntarily working very hard. He documents like 1,000-hour increase in the number of hours people work over the course of a couple hundred years, from about, I think, 1300 to 1900, so maybe more than a couple hundred. But over the course of several hundred years, people start taking fewer days off. They work longer hours, and by this height of the First Industrial Revolution, you're seeing some really long hours being worked there, and then you're also seeing it as being associated with the language that I referred to earlier as it being associated with God. And there's one additional piece of evidence that he refers to, which is the fact that people view time as money. That's a unique thing to the West. And basically, he talks about the introduction of clock towers and how Europe's market towns all built clock towers. And that was something nobody else did. Organizing your day around time and thinking of time as a resource that was finite was something that was unique to these places, and he says is unique even today. And so the idea that you sort of view it as I could be working right now, and that's a valuable thing that I could be doing instead of this thing, that's not something that everybody has in the world. He tells the story about giving watches to his research assistants in Fiji and realizing that they never set the time, but they like to wear them because they look cool. So that's that. And then just to come back to this question of pace that Bethany raised, one thing that is worth noting is that the pace of these innovations is over the course of about a millennium. So he kind of starts the story at about 900 AD. It's a little bit of an oversimplification. It kind of starts earlier, but let's say about 900 AD, and then it continues till today. And you see sort of the role of work becoming more and more central. And it's really in the high Middle Ages where work starts to take on this central role in people's identity, and even going from there where work becomes, associated with God, and these work hours go up so much. So from about 900 to about 1900, you're really seeing these gradual increases in the importance of work in people's psyche. I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you if you could highlight a little bit more the role of incentives and how did the Catholic Church maybe change incentives other than breaking up the clan structure? Like, how did people become incentivized to hold these beliefs about work and to work these really long hours and have the sense of opportunity cost, that kind of thing?
I think that he doesn't do a great job of figuring that out. And I think that that's an open question to some extent in my mind. But basically, he says it kind of falls out from breaking up the clan structure, because what you're left with is now you're an individual. And whereas before, your identity is within this network, like who are you within this network and what clan do you belong to? Your identity now is, my name is Erez. Well, Erez, are you going to steal my stuff? Are you going to, if I pay you to do something, you actually going to do it? And so on. And there's no recourse against me other than physical violence against me personally. There's no recourse against me the way there is in a clan-based structure where you punish, your clan punishes the other clan. If somebody within the clan doesn't do what they say that they'll do, and so on. And so you have these this new structure where my honor and my reputation is totally tied to me, whereas before my honor and my reputation extended to my whole clan. And then he says that creates these incentives to worry about your own time. Whereas before, if you worked harder, then you didn't get to keep it. You gave it away to your clan, and now you do. And if you were given something, he talks about the fact that the endowment effect, which is this famous thing in psychology, where if you give somebody a mug, and you ask them how much they'd be willing to sell it for, they tell you like, I don't know, 13, 14 bucks. I like this mug. If you ask somebody like, how much would you like to pay for that mug? And you don't give it to them first, they'd be like, I don't know, like $3. It's fine. And so people like stuff that's theirs a lot. And the endowment effect is particularly strong for stuff that you've built yourself. So if you build a piece of IKEA furniture, you start to like it more than if somebody else built the same piece of furniture, even if that person's better at building IKEA furniture. And so he talks about the fact that that's something that you would expect if your identity is really tied to the individual and you get to keep all of the earnings that you, or most of the earnings that you raise, and you don't have to share them as broadly with a clan. So I think he thinks it's mostly coming from there. And that makes some sense to me, but that's probably not the whole picture. And I think it would be good to flesh it out more.
Yeah, that's kind of a story of work becoming more central because of the psychology of the individual being altered by this shift in your family size, that kind of thing. But you kind of have to wonder if there isn't some kind of incentive coming from the top down in terms of the structures there that want more labor to be performed, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Well, I'll just add that, I mean, you might have thought that the clans would also want individual members to work really hard because they're getting the benefits. So like there was kind of an incentive there too, but maybe because the proceeds were also getting shared more with the clans in a certain diffuse kind of way, like it's like harder to achieve that, right? Because how much can I have an incentive to work when it's going to be given away to some extent? And perhaps the change in structure to keeping more of it for my immediate family that's really genetically related to me had a big influence. I also just wonder though, like how much of this is kind of complicated and maybe hard to pin down, but related to like just the scaling up of economic development and just general returns to work becoming larger and larger in terms of the opportunity cost that you were talking about. There might be kind of like a chicken and an egg problem there a little bit, but since the scaling,
he admits that he's not very shy about the fact that there is a sort of a recursive loop here and sort of these self-reinforcing cycles, but also, well, yeah, I don't have much more to add.
Yeah, but we can also open it up to other people's questions.
Yeah, I just want to put one more thing out there, which is that if you have kind of a clan-based system, then even if your family is large, you still are kind of working within a framework where most people kind of know each other. Maybe it's like lower than Dunbar's number, and you have all these social incentives. You don't need, to pay people as much because everybody's kind of, everyone knows each other, right? Whereas if you have a large-scale market economy, now that's not going to work anymore at the large scale. So now that's where money comes in as an incentive. But you do have this interface between the large scale and the small scale. You work in the large scale economy and get paid, and then you have your small scale family, which is even smaller scale than it used to be, right? And the way in which you contribute is by bringing money in from that large scale context. So you have these social incentives within the family to work hard, to earn a lot of money to support the family, right? So you have kind of this hybrid of both going on. So just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah, I agree with that, and it reminds me that there is sort of a middle ground, and we do see these still clan-based but market-oriented families, including sort of larger Jewish families that have been merchants for a long time, and the East Asian families that I mentioned earlier. Sort of exhibit something that's in between the two, where they do take some pride in their work, but they don't necessarily identify with it quite as strongly as they do with other things.
Cool. Let's go to Austin. Go ahead, Austin. If you're there.
I am here, so I just had to unlock my phone before I unmuted it. I had a couple of things. One, I was really curious about the research about how people identify themselves. So Erez was saying that in, other cultures, or I think even said most cultures, if you ask someone who they are, they identify themselves with sort of kinship titles rather than profession. And that strikes me as surprising because, I've traveled a fair bit, and, even in sort of like the Amazon jungle, people will be like, there's kinship, there's place, and there's role. There's I'm such and such from such and such. My family is this, and I do that. You know what I mean? Like it seems people's identities are components. So there's sort of always been like, and even like in indigenous societies and stuff, there's, there are roles within the group that people have as, a hunter or a shaman or some other status that comes from a task that's performed, although that might be composite. They might have multiple roles, right? So I'm curious about that research. And I just wanted to introduce as well a little bit of a sort of a Marxist angle on it, which is the idea of alienation. So we were talking before about the endowment effect. And to an extent, I feel like there's actually the opposite actually happens when you enter a large market economy. So Marx defined alienation. It's a very interesting concept. Like the simple version of it is though, a craftsperson makes a shoe and sells a shoe, right? A worker sells an hour of his labor, and therefore he is alienated from the labor. He is selling himself, not selling a product, right? So it's actually this idea that the endowment, so moving to a large market economy where we're employed by in large institutions actually seems to run contrary to the endowment effect. And so what's driving it? And I feel like there's a, the elephant in the room with me, I always think is violence. I always, maybe I've got a dark mind, but I tend to think that there's, like social incentives and stuff often end up being finally enforced by violence. Like, so the prohibition against homosexuality, at first people would be like, when if someone expresses the wrong sexual interest, to be like, hey, don't be gross. That if you keep doing it, they'll beat the shit out of you. That used to be how, or kill you, right? That was how that social pressure of, heteronormativity was enforced. And I think what the stuff that Carl Wiederquist, who comes in this group sometimes, talks about how like there was this period of violent incorporation into the capitalist system. For one, I don't really like using that word, but I just use, because I think it's a little bit inexact, but the state corporate complex kind of took over the world in phases, and violence was a huge part of that. And it's a little bit like the experiment with the gorillas and the ladder, so there's the experiment is you have a bunch, or maybe chimps or whatever, I don't know the primate, but they have primates in a room. There's a ladder at the top of the ladder. There's a banana or something that they want. Every time someone tries to climb the ladder, they spray them all with ice cold water, which they hate. And they then learn not to do it. And then you can start bringing in a new monkey. And if it'll try and climb the ladder, and all the other monkeys will say, hey, don't do that, right? And then you can actually change out all the monkeys, and the taboo on climbing the ladder and getting the fruit will remain, even though none of the monkeys have experienced the ice cold water anymore. So we might not be experiencing that direct violence because none of us are trying to go, hey, let's go set up, an independent society on this river and like sort of disengage, right? Like we've all been herded into mass society, and we've all been conditioned by sort of historic violence. And I just sort of wonder so the two questions are, what's the role of violence with all of that framing? And secondly, firstly, can you talk a bit more about the research of how people identify themselves in other cultures, and what's, how solid are the numbers on that?
Yeah, so just to tack onto that, I think the story about the monkeys and the ladder is something that never actually happened. Like, it's an interesting story to kind of illustrate a point, but I think it's not real. The first person who told me this story was actually Moshe's advisor, Amir, and he told the whole story, and everyone was kind of enraptured. And then he said, yeah, but it actually didn't happen. So that was actually when I first heard about it. But in terms of violence, a question we can ask is there some process that's happening for some reason and violence is merely kind of the means by which it happens, or is violence like the ultimate cause of what's going on as well? So I'll throw it over to Erez.
I'll start with the data. So I think Joe's data is actually quite good. I just pulled up in fact, I could probably share my screen, but whatever. In the book, he's got the charts that he pulls. In some cases, he pulls them from individual papers. In some cases, he actually assembles data from, every paper he knows of, and he'll do a meta-analysis effectively. Simple meta-analysis in one chart. When it comes to the data on who am I am blank, fill in the blank. It's actually fairly striking. So what they'll do this in, they've done this both across the world, but and then they've done it with folks just within a single country. And Kenya was the country where they found enough variation that they could do this in. So if you do this amongst the Samburu or the Maasai, which are these clans that are still living fairly traditional lifestyles, the proportion of answers that people give that involve personal attributes, abilities, and aspirations. And so that includes things like your job, that and plus other things. The proportion is about 10 or 11%, I think, for the Maasai, and for the Samburu, it's like 2%. But as soon as you get to Nairobi undergrads and US undergrads, the proportion who give those responses goes up above 50%. And for Nairobi laborers, it's actually somewhere in between. So pretty striking pattern. He repeats this across societies in the world. He doesn't just have this for folks in Kenya. Kenya, and he finds a similar pattern. And then when it comes to the endowment effect, that data actually comes from, let me see if I can find it. I think I did, because it was sort of adjacent, I didn't actually highlight it. And so I don't think I have it in front of me, but I remember seeing the figure that he has there. And again, they basically had people play standard economics games, but had them play them in a bunch of different countries. The person who led this research was a researcher at Penn named Corinna Pisella, who worked with Joe for a while. And you will find that the quality of that research is super high. And I think you're right that it's like really a counterintuitive result. But I think what's going on there is, if I'm going to sell my stuff, then I need to value it highly in order to demand the proper wage for my labor. And so the endowment effect actually gets me to negotiate over my labor properly, and to not give away my stuff too easily if it's not stuff that I made. And so it kind of makes sense that if you need to negotiate over whether you will give something away, then you should have an endowment effect. If you don't, and somebody just takes your stuff because it's just belongs to the whole clan, then there's no need to have an endowment effect. So that's where it's coming from. Even though I agree, it's counterintuitive. Like, you would think that if somebody is constantly giving away the products of their labor, they wouldn't develop an endowment effect, but it's actually the opposite prediction.
And it brings up the interesting question, which parts of our psychology are biologically hardwired and which parts aren't. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, you can jump in on this too, but in terms of the question of violence, so violence is like a really extreme incentive, and it definitely goes on. And I think probably in the history that Erez was talking about over all those centuries, I would be shocked if violence wasn't one tool that the Catholic Church used to enforce a lot of this stuff that he's talking about. I think Erez and I tend to focus on it less because maybe more of the time it's obvious. I'm not sure, maybe not always. So maybe we should focus on it more, but social incentives can be a little more outside of our awareness. And so we tend to focus on those in our own work. But one thing that may not be obvious is the connection between violence and people's ideologies that are really internalized. So I think we all know that, like, for whatever I want to do, if somebody's holding a gun to my head, I might just do something else. But what might be less obvious is that, like, over time, and you mentioned this aspect of time too, Austin, like over time, the things that people hold a gun to my head and force me not to do might become things that I don't even want to do. And that's maybe more the surprising way in which violence, along with these other incentives, can play a role. And, I wasn't talking about violence in my intro, but the kinds of incentives related to having a job are pretty high stakes. They're not just like reputation or how many friends do I have. It's also like, do I get to eat? Do I get to have a secure home? Do I get to have health insurance? So these are really high stakes things. And yet we maybe don't always think about the way that that's going to shape the fact that I think a job is really important for my mental health, or that, I feel bad about myself if I don't have a job. It's sort of almost surprising to me now that I've done this work for so long that that's not more clear to people. But you do have people writing books saying, no, people really need to work for reasons other than the resources, because we don't necessarily connect the things that I come to want to do with the things that get me resources. And so again, not violence, but I think survival is pretty high stakes in these other ways as tied to a job. So I think with this basic income discussion, we actually are talking about pretty blatant incentives. Often Erez and I are talking about much more subtle ways that incentives operate. But we run the gamut. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Eve. No, good. I take some other questions.
Let's go to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, actually, you kind of answered my question a little bit with that answer, but I was going to ask, you're clearly making a distinction between paid work versus other kinds of work, and a lot of these authors you're responding to in the article that we're responding to today, doesn't make that distinction. I guess like something that strikes me as notable, it depends like what we think of as paid work. You could include different things in that category or not. Like, do we count making profit or starting a business? Is that a paid incentive? Well, it sort of is. There's an incentive for them to do that, but it's also, you're not getting paid in advance the way workers are, right? So they're not really subject. It's very different. They're not actually getting that kind of immediate survival relief that the worker is. They're actually taking liabilities off and up front. So it seems like in the current society, there is a role for work that one just sort of goes out and does and isn't immediately paid to do by someone else. And I guess, like, do you see why do you think there is so much emphasis on work, as in getting a job, working for a boss, getting paid that way, as opposed to this other way, which is kind of popular, right? And people will go out and start a business or start an online store or something, right? Like, why do we have a culture that's interested in formal, jobs, wage labor, and not so much in like, okay, go out and work and, join the economy or join the market, something like that?
Yeah, so good question. A couple of things I want to respond to there. So one thing is I think that we do value entrepreneurship in our particular, at least in America, but I think that it's a lot less secure. So in your day-to-day life, people are probably going to say like, why don't you go get a job, as opposed to why don't you start a business, for the average person, because the failure rate is really, really high. And like I said, we're depending on this for like our absolute survival. So, it's just not going to be the solution that people are offering for survival to everybody all the time as a routine kind of thing. Paid labor is just a lot safer, easier to get as sort of a stable way to survive. So that's my sense for that. But another thing you brought up for me is kind of relates to what Erez is talking about. There are sort of different levels of ideologies and incentives. So I was focusing on paid work because I think that's the thing that might change the most with a basic income. And even though these articles kind of, I think, equivocate a little bit about it, their emphasis is on unemployment, not like, will these people have any opportunity to do something useful? So even though like some of their research that they cite doesn't really specify that it has to be paid work, I think the implication often is that without a paid job, people don't have a way to have something, useful to contribute, which isn't really true, but there's that conflation happens a lot.
They're not talking about idleness. They're talking about a lack of a job. So they don't know if you're sitting at home sewing sweaters for your friends.
Right. And in fact, in the article, they even say, if you guys had a chance to read it, they even say like, at first people get laid off. They're kind of happy they have more time to do other productive things like clean out their garage or something. So they're not necessarily being idle. But, I think they don't specify why they start to get depressed after 5 weeks or so. But I think part of it might be like they're starting to get worried about, their survival. Maybe they run out of things to do in the short term too, but that's so yeah. But the other thing though is like Erez is broader picture is kind of a deeper point about work that isn't just about paid labor. Probably like for example, the opportunity cost of time psychology is something that's developed over centuries and isn't just about a paid job. You might not have a paid job and still be thinking like, oh, this is the productive stuff that I could be doing with this time, that kind of thing. So if we think about the world like changing and maybe changing with basic income and what things would change and how quickly, my guess is that that there are smaller adjustments one could make with respect to whether I spend my time on a paid job or not, that would still be basically maintaining the same psychology that Erez has talked about developing over time. So I might still want to be productive or think of myself as an individual and identify with what I do, but maybe what I do is like being an awesome skateboarder or making amazing video games in my spare time, and I don't actually get paid for that. But I'm still like working really hard on it, or I'm still proud of it, and that's still how I identify, and I still think about time, and I still have a clock, and all these kinds of things. Whereas like you could imagine maybe if like the economy really changed drastically over the centuries, then like deeper aspects of our psychology might change. And so it depends kind of like what the time scale is and what the change is. And my personal guess is that adjusting to, not having paid labor, it'll be different for different people not having a job, but like that could happen probably a lot faster than like adjusting to a different perspective on work in a more broad sense, that in terms of like doing something that sort of uses my talents and contributes and all of those kinds of things. And then there might be a layer that's genetic, or there might be some sense in which I should feel like I'm doing something that people tend to value, and maybe that could be within my clan, and like maybe it could be a talent work thing, but something, maybe that's genetic, and something like that will always be there. So there's kind of these different layers, and how sticky they are, kind of depends on what the origin is and that kind of thing. So I don't know if you want to add to that, but there are a few interesting things in your question there, Derek. Yeah.
So about the psychology of the opportunity cost of time, it feels a little bit weird to me that would be something that would evolve, that we wouldn't always have, because there's always 24 hours in a day, and you always have to decide if you're going to do one thing or another thing. Is it that we didn't have the psychology of the opportunity cost of time before, or is it that time became standardized and easily translatable into units of money or something like that?
Again, I think you're asking questions that are deeper than he's answered them in the book. So I'm going to have to guess a little bit. It is telling that time becomes important in places with in Europe first. So you had the ability to build clocks. It actually came you had sun clocks long before in the Muslim world and in the ancient world. And so you had the ability to build clocks, and Muslim leaders actually would hire European clockmakers to build clocks in their towns as a show of wealth, but they never used them, and they were often not actually, they weren't accurate. And there wasn't a sense in which the economy really revolved around them in the way that it did in Europe, where times of meetings were respected, and that was an expectation. And I suspect that that's coming from, you kind of need that for the intensive market economy to work well, and perhaps you don't need it quite as much in these other environments. You can tell somebody, if you're making a living by being a shopkeeper, then you have appointments, and you have to keep those appointments. And so I think there are obviously shopkeepers in other places of the world, but I guess that they're not quite as specialized in, like, say, shoemaking or something like that, and so you might not need it quite as much. And I think he's getting it from that. But I think it's an open question. I'm not super confident in that answer.
Yeah, I wanted to jump into, because there's a difference between, I was thinking there's a difference between opportunity cost of time and having to consciously think about opportunity cost of time. So I'm thinking of Annabelle, our daughter, who doesn't think about opportunity cost of time at all, but she's constantly doing things that to her are productive. And she has to, her brain in some way has to manage what she's focused on and what she's doing and all of that, but she doesn't have to think about it. So why this might be relevant to adults is, if you have a very structured life.
For the record, she's 5 months old.
She's 5 months, yeah. So if you're in a society that doesn't have a lot of choice, for example, everything is kind of structured for you and you don't really get to choose, you don't have to think about it. Or if you have good intuitions and those can kind of guide you, maybe there are other ways that people are making trade-offs and deciding what to do with their time and how to manage opportunity costs that don't involve thinking actively about it. And I think almost that makes sense that would be the norm for organisms in general. They always have to manage opportunity costs. They don't always have to think about it. So this is just speculation, but I could imagine that as you have more and more options and more individualism, where people are actually choosing more as opposed to roles and how you spend the day kind of being structured for you, it becomes more important to start to think about trade-offs. It's really about thinking about those trade-offs, because you have trade-offs, you have these options. This is, again, speculation, but I could imagine that's part of it. The other thing I wonder, and I haven't read this book, I should, so I don't know for sure, but I wonder if there's a difference between thinking about opportunity cost and thinking about work as the primary thing that you would anchor on for opportunity cost. So I don't know which one he demonstrated more clearly, but perhaps I would have always thought oh, I'm working with these cows, but I kind of wish I were with my daughter or something like that. But maybe I wouldn't think about work as the key default. I don't know if it was that or if it's opportunity cost in general. Maybe Erez can jump in with it.
He talks about the fact that people view, in many cultures, you spend time with somebody and there isn't supposed to be a bound on that, and you just spend time with somebody for as long as it feels good, and then you move on to the next thing that you're going to do. And if that takes 5 hours, it takes 5 hours. That's just how you build a good relationship. Whereas in our culture, we're going to meet for an hour, and I've got at 2:00, and in a lot of cultures that would be viewed as rude. Whereas in our culture, being late would be viewed as rude. And whereas being late is not necessarily viewed as a big deal, often in these other cultures. If you've traveled, right? Nobody is particularly concerned about being on time in a lot of places.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because that speaks to me to just different trade-offs. So if you're prioritizing being able to form a relationship really well, because there are a lot of things you can't predict, and maybe it needs to take 5 hours to get to the bottom of an important interaction or something like that. And so it just seems like they're doing trade-offs differently, and having a precisely working schedule that aligns with all sorts of strangers and stuff just isn't the priority if you don't have maybe a strong market economy or other factors kind of working against the value of those relationships. So that makes sense to me.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think it's true that everybody cares about time, at least on the seasons or, the days, right? You're going to go to bed at night and that kind of thing. What's special here is just kind of getting it down to the hour and the minute and keeping close track. And it makes sense to me that corresponds to kind of facilitating this, kind of rapid market activity that needs to happen simultaneously and that kind of stuff. That makes sense to me.
And probably you're keeping track of time in that 5-hour interaction, because something tells both parties oh, it's time to end now. So there is some intuition that something has been accomplished, but it's not like pre-specified, or it's able to be more organic or whatever.
Yeah, you might
Yeah,
say
he
the
called-
sun is getting low in the sky instead of, oh, it's 5 o'clock or something like that.
Right, but in general, the phenomenon he's trying to explain is time thrift, and he says time thrift
Right.
is unique to us, and that to me feels like it's pretty closely related to this idea that you have work as something that you like really value, and that you're giving it up in order to have the interaction.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's go to David. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I've got some sort of scattered thought about this, but I hope you'll bear with me for a minute because I think it's interesting. I like to talk about the clans and people sort of identifying with the families, the broader families that they came from, and it made me think about how Alex talks about money being a swap of IOUs, and that that we sort of begin life sort of indebted to our families, where people are very vulnerable and cannot survive very well without can't survive at all without our families, and then sort of the natural world. And I wonder if our sort of obedience to our family often is sort of bred into us, because the families are projecting their children, and to some degree are their savings. They provide for the children and when the children are young, and then the children will provide for them when they're older. And that's sort of a swap of an IOU, and that is actually a sort of a form of money. And that kind of swap of IOU, this sort of sense of indebtedness to our community, can happen without money. We can go and do things for our neighbors and for other people who are in our community, and there's.
Oh, I think we lost you, David. You there? Okay, so he's talking about reciprocity that's maybe not literal money. Either of you guys want to speak to that?
Oh yeah, we think about this all the time, so we'll probably both want to jump in. But one thing I'll say is that we think about the at least the nuclear family and sort of reciprocity in the community kind of differently, because we have this strong genetic relationship with our family members. So even if your child never paid you back at all, you would imagine that parents might invest quite a bit in their child's survival, because the parents who didn't do that, those genes kind of died off with those kids who didn't survive. And so the ones who are around are the ones who invest enough in their kids to at least have them survive and have grandkids and things like that. So that's a different mechanism that's available. Not to say that other reciprocal mechanisms aren't also available to immediate family, they are, but there's like this additional genetic relationship that's really powerful there. And in the community, that genetic relationship is quite weak, or it's not really there as strong as a motivator. So the dynamics that you need are a little bit different, and it's harder to get non-reciprocal cooperation in the community, in the sense that you want to get paid back in some way usually, and it can be over long periods of time in a very mutual kind of way, as David was talking about, where you give to others and then they give back to you. It can be direct, like I help out Alex and then Alex helps out me, or it can be indirect, like I help out Alex, then I'm in good standing with the community, and then Erez is going to help out me, and then because of that he gets helped out. So it can be like very sophisticated. There are different kind of game theory models that map this out, but that's one of the things I was talking about when I talked about other kinds of motivations for contribution besides paid money. And in fact, money is later to the table probably than a lot of these other kinds of motivations, like social reputation and reciprocal cooperation, the way that you were talking about, David, and genetic relationship and families too. So those are probably earlier. And now with this really, really large scale, where it might be really hard to keep track or hard to just have those kinds of cooperative norms, you can also have money as something that's really powerful to incentivize people, but it's not the only way. So maybe David is back and kind of like finish his question, but I definitely think about those different kinds of motivation, or maybe Erez wants to jump in with something on that. Okay. Yeah,
David,
I don't
you
know if
there?
I answered your question, David, or if you want to ask a little more.
Yeah, I think it was coming into Wi-Fi service. But yeah, I think that's what I mean. I think reciprocity is the right word, and I think that the article, it talks about, to bring it back to the article, it talks about employment. People need this employment, but I think that there's a distinction between the basic income employment and an employment situation without income, because there's this. Typically when we talk about unemployment, we're talking about involuntary unemployment, and the alternative, is to look at like like Alex often does, is this is leisure time. But maybe there's something sort of in between, involuntary unemployment and leisure time, where we're doing where we have these reciprocity relationships with our community, that is that thing that gives us value and makes us feel connected to our community. I think being able to contribute to your community in a reciprocity relationship where you get standing in your community, like you say, and in return, I think that's actually really important to people. I think people deeply value that standing in their community, whether that's a genetic reason or whether or not that's something that's taught because of your relationship with whoever provided for you as a child. I think it's important to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's always going to be important to us. But I think the important limitation to pay attention to is that these kinds of social incentives don't work when you scale up to, millions and billions of people, right? So this is kind of what I was getting at earlier, where you have these social incentives in a group where everyone knows each other, and, you kind of have these reputations and that kind of thing. In a large scale market economy, you don't have that. And that's kind of where money comes into play. Derek said to me once that money is for people you don't know. So there's all kinds of incentives involved for people you do know, and then money is for people you don't know. If that's helpful. Go ahead, Bethany.
Oh, I just want to add, that said, I think what David might be getting at is, if you imagine, okay, what happens if we don't need a lot of people to do paid labor anymore? I mean, I think these kinds of reciprocal relationships and sort of other things that people do to contribute based on social incentives might play an even larger role. And I agree that they already play a large role in kind of what's motivating people. There are a couple other things too that aren't about reciprocity. So there's also kind of basically just like showing off. So there's demonstrating like your skills or your wealth or whatever with like doing all sorts of things. And so that kind of thing can be involved in like developing an expertise or a talent or that kind of stuff. So we see that now, and you might see even more of that as well. And that's not something where people have to pay you back. It's more like to attract people to be your friend or your partner or whatever. So you might see that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of things you might be interested in doing if you didn't have to go out and earn money in the larger economy. And that can include stuff related to social incentives, related to reciprocity, related to anything, with your local community, that kind of thing, or, it could be something selfish or something like that. I think there are a lot of possibilities there.
And I'll just say one more thing there, which is this is all a matter of degree, really. So in terms of the amount of shift that it requires in our psychology, it's not huge. It's not like the kinds of shifts, again, that like Erez was describing over, long periods of time. It's we already are motivated quite a bit by like this showing off stuff, by these reciprocal relationships. So it would just be more of our time on that it's not like really a fundamental qualitative change. And so I think that makes it more plausible that it could happen, relatively quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like to say that most of the important work that people do is not paid, and you only pay people when you need them to do something different. And I like that you brought up the continuum, because David was talking about kind of voluntary work versus involuntary work. I think that's a continuum too. So obviously, if you have a basic income, the higher the basic income is, the less you need the money to be paid. So maybe you're still deciding to work because you want more money, but it might seem more voluntary than it is in a world where if you didn't have that money, you wouldn't survive, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump in just one more time. I like that you pointed that out, because it's not either or too. Like sometimes it kind of is, like sometimes paying people sort of undermines the social incentives, but other times they're a little bit of both. So like sometimes you have to be paid less for a job that's also like highly respected, and maybe you have to be paid more for a job that is seen as kind of like nasty or evil. Like Alex likes to speculate that maybe investment bankers have to be paid more because they don't get a good reputation, whereas school teachers might have to be paid less because they do get a good reputation. So that's also possible that like they trade off against each other a little bit in terms of payment, social sort of benefits versus monetary payment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Let's go to Neil. Go ahead, Neil.
I have a different personal viewpoint. What can happen has happened with a lot of people, I understand, in this society. At 16 years old, I was by myself. I had basically my family was not available, and I got sick. So I had a struggle to live. So I developed an idea that everything I had to put all my energy into my work, because if I didn't, I'd probably die. So I became that became my motivation. Okay, now so from then on, everything I did was in that vein. I try to learn about macroeconomics. I try to understand politics. I try to the world that way, just because I was forced into it. Then about 2.5 years ago, my job disappeared. Okay, so what do? Okay, so I search for something else to do, which I can put all my energies into and be as good as I can be at it, because that's what I do now. I figured out how to control my physical ailment, but that doesn't matter. I'm still back there when it seemed to be my life. In order to live, I had to do it. So I still do that, and I understand other people have that similar situation. So anyways, so my motivation, I don't have to be motivated at all. I will search for something which I can pour all my energy into, because my family is very diffuse. I have them, but very, very diffuse, and I've learned to put all my energies into whatever I do to the full extent I can. So I do. So my two interests you may have heard about them is I sing. It turns out and of course I have the same motivation as everybody else. I want to be like, I want to have people like what I do. So I put it on YouTube, and the other thing is I figured out a complication the way humans process sugar. So I set up a website and explained what I figured out, and basically I'm read throughout the world. And
all right.
I just want to point out that there aren't everybody is motivated the way you say, but
yeah. So it sounds like, Neil, that you're highly self-motivated. So a question we can ask is, where does self-motivation come from, and how much?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Well, yeah, and then how much of it is intrinsic, how much of it is the result of necessity. Would you have been motivated in the same way in a basic income world, right? Maybe. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to jump in. Erez and I were in the chat a little bit saying that I think this is a really nice illustration, Neil, and I'm glad you shared, of exactly the kind of dynamics that we're talking about, but within a person's life. So as I understood it, Neil was saying that like he had a really even more than most people have, the necessity to work hard to survive in our society, which is already pretty high. He had an even stronger motivation because he didn't have any, he had this health condition that needed to be taken care of urgently. And so what I was hearing is that created a strong work ethic that was then internalized to the point that even when the initial necessity is gone and it's retirement time or he's managed to be okay in terms of health insurance and so on, the drive to be like working really hard at something is still there, and kind of gets carried over even to unpaid labor. And so I think that that's exactly the kind of point that we would make in the short term, is that people's incentives shape things that they prefer to do or that they believe, and then that can persist. That doesn't necessarily go away immediately when those incentives go away. And an open question is kind of like what we've been talking about, is sort of like, how long does it persist? But I think that, as we've been saying, in our culture, this desire to be like working hard on things and productive at things is likely to stick around for at least a while, even if it's not incentivized in quite the same way, at least monetarily. And you can shift it perhaps to other kinds of things. So in a way, Neil's story is also suggesting, at least for Neil personally, a fair amount of flexibility in whether that has to be from a paid job or not. Whether that would scale to others, I don't know. But yeah, Erez, do you want to?
Yeah, I think Neil's story is also telling in that it's parallels, I think, a lot of people's experience when they have the opposite experience, and they actually are fairly lucky, they're fairly privileged, and yet they are in a society that values hard work, and they become very hardworking individuals. It's something that doesn't necessarily pay very much, but otherwise gives these social returns. So think about people who might open a cafe or go into journalism or these other fields where the pay is shit. It's just terrible. But the risk is very high and the hours are long, but the job has some cachet. And so they're able to sort of afford to do that. Thanks to a little bit of a nest egg from their folks, and then nonetheless they still sort of have this ethic that carries through, and that's been imbued in them from their families and from the society as a whole, where that identity is not coming from the need to make money, but still society values the industriousness.
Yeah, let's go to Chance. Go ahead, Chance.
Sure. Yeah. So, so the question of like how intrinsically motivated people are to just carry on working and stuff is really interesting. And then like at the population level, I'm sure it's just on a bell curve like anything else. But even if we assume like the worst case scenario, you often hear like people talk about people winning the lottery and then just like falling apart. Like they don't know how to deal with themselves. They get really depressed and stuff like that. But I think in that case, like it's not a fair comparison, because something like a basic income would be universal, and it would be suddenly the entire society is trying to figure out how to motivate themselves to work. And I think the ingenuity of like every single community in the country would be able to find ways to do that, because I think we're just so socially motivated in the first place that even if you are just like the biggest slouch in the world, and humans are by default, I think there are still going to be people in their communities that sort of inspire them and drive them to follow them into different domains, whether it's like music, art, architecture, I don't know, cleaning up the streets, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think I have a few distinctions I want to make, and I like this point. So there are different reasons we would care about people's motivation to do various kinds of things. And I guess I just want to make those clear. So one thing is that we actually need the work done in society. And there, at least according to how Alex thinks about a calibrated basic income, basically what happens is if people don't do it without the money, then you have to pay them money to do it. And that means the overall basic income might be a bit lower, because you need sort of to withhold, in a sense, some basic income to kind of motivate people to do that work. That's one reason we might be interested in it. Would just kind of affect the level of the basic income. Another reason, though, is this deeper question of like, do people need to be doing something that they feel is productive to be happy? And that's something that may come from like these centuries of change that Erez is talking about. Maybe people in other societies and small scale societies or whatever don't even need that, but maybe we do. And if so, like, can people find that on their own, or do they need help finding that in our society if they don't have paid work as the outlet? And so I think that I just wanted to separate those two different things. It's for people's own happiness or for the work actually getting done. Those are kind of two separate kind of reasons we would be interested in what people are spontaneously motivated to do or able to do. And so I think it's an interesting question, given that we seem to find that many people do want to do something that feels productive to be happy in our culture, the way that we've all been raised, here, can people do that on their own? And I think you were speaking to that, or in their communities, kind of like spontaneously without, I don't know, like government assistance or something. And I think that to a large extent that they probably can, but I'm also open to it being quite challenging, or something that, has a process of transition. I think retirement is an interesting example. I haven't studied it deeply, but that's like a transition a lot of people go through, that it's socially acceptable to stop working, but you don't have that sort of structure of meaning and purpose from a paid job. And from what little I know, some people really thrive in that and some people don't as much. And so, that you could maybe extrapolate slightly from something like that. One more small point on the lottery. I haven't actually researched these like anecdotes or seen if it's like systematic, but I do think, as you pointed out, it's not really like an apt comparison for a number of reasons. Like, one is it's a huge amount of money, like it's a huge shock, and your money goes way up. I don't know if it's always paid out in increments either. So like there could be problems with like a huge shock of money that people could then spend and then they don't have it anymore, that kind of thing. And not everybody around you is getting it. So maybe some of the problems are people like, being after them for the money. And, so there's all sorts of things that are not really analogous to like a universal basic income, I think, there, as you point out. I think the retirement is a slightly better analogy, even though it's not perfect.
I think something important that Chance is highlighting is the difference between one person having to adapt and the entire culture having to adapt to a change. So that's true for our psychology if the world around us is changing and our culture changes. It's also true for the economics, right? If you run a pilot program of a basic income where you give some people some money, you're just seeing how individual people respond. You're not seeing how the macroeconomy responds. So these are kind of important things to keep in mind when we're doing something that changes the whole economy or potentially changes the whole culture.
Yeah, that's big. Like in these experiments, also they're often looking at things like whether people stop working or not. But of course, like first of all, the basic income usually isn't permanent in the experiment, and second, like people around them are still needing to work and all these other kinds of things. So there's a lot of confounds to interpreting what would happen if you scaled it up. Yeah. Did you have a follow-up question, Lance? I saw that you raised your hand again.
Well, I was just going to add that, like, there's no, I mean, this is a thing that, the equivocation that you're pointing out from the article that we just hear all over the place, where meaning and work are just like the same thing. And in particular, wage labor and meaning. That's just a cultural artifact. And I'm glad you guys are pointing it out. But it's obviously a cultural artifact because there's just no logical connection between meaning and wage labor. Wages didn't even exist, like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. I don't know how long you have to go back, but that wasn't a thing really. It was all cultural, social pressure, other motivators, environmental stuff.
Feudalism.
Right. So I see like infinitely many ways to motivate people to work outside of the wage labor system and find meaning, I should say.
Yeah. So this gets to a quote from the article that I want to share here. It may seem cliche, but work is not all about the money, and research proves it. People want to work. They want to do meaningful things, said Art Goldsmith, a professor of economics at Washington and Lee University, who has researched the psychological effects of unemployment. So, I mean, I think they're doing this thing, which you guys brought up before, which is they're assuming that work means paid work, and they're not really distinguishing between a paid job and just work that's meaningful, that does something useful, that kind of thing. And they really don't make a clear distinction in the article. But it is something that comes up a lot in these discussions. Like I often like to say that people need money, not jobs. And then someone else will come back to me and say, well, a job is more than just a paycheck. People need jobs to feel meaning and purpose in their lives. The need to contribute is what drives people and gives them fulfillment. So we can ask, like maybe people do need jobs, but then you can ask, why do they need jobs? To what extent is it true that they need it? And then to what extent, is it something that is an adaptation to incentives? And even if, and to what extent can it change? That kind of thing. Go ahead, Bethany.
Let me just say, I mean, I pulled that quote actually in my intro too. And I think that there are a couple things. So one, as I pointed out in the intro, what if you don't think jobs are important? And then you're not as motivated to go get one, or if you get one, you don't seem as motivated. Neither of those things are good for you. So it may be true that people really do, in particular, want to find meaning from their paid job right now, but that might be a function of the way that the economy works right now and what people need from it. And the other thing is that because you have to spend so much of your time usually in our culture or economy at your job, if you also want to find meaning and purpose and ways to contribute for other reasons, a job is a good avenue for it because you have to spend a lot of your time there anyway. So if you're not finding any meaning or purpose there, that's a huge chunk of your time completely wasted. So of course, people might, even if they have sort of other motivations that to contribute in other ways for social reasons or whatever else, they might try to combine the two. And as Erez pointed out, like people often do sort of trying to find various hybrids of kind of like being paid less, maybe contributing more, or maybe hopefully being paid a lot and contributing and getting like good social kudos or whatever. So the fact that we have to spend so much of our time at a job also kind of maybe forces more things to be found in a job than would otherwise need to be found in a paid job, because you don't necessarily have as much time left in the day. Yeah, did you want to?
Well, actually, Alex, you need to move on, or should I add to that?
No, go ahead.
The one thing to notice is that it's not just coming from the fact that you have to spend a lot of time at your job, but also at the payoff to really caring about your job and doing an amazing job at it. And what you'll find is that in cultures where upward mobility within the workplace is limited, people's identity is less tied to their job. The classic example of this is Europe, where your chances of making it big in the commercial world are actually fairly small. Wage distributions are much more compressed, and as a consequence, you seem to see that people don't care that much about the job the way that they do here. So I think I just add that it's not just about time. It does seem to be about like, what are the opportunities that caring about your job create?
Yeah, thanks. Good point.
Yeah, I think another example is like low level, like fast food workers, service jobs, that kind of thing. You see the same kind of phenomenon there, where you're not gonna, make it big by being, really fast at the drive-through window or something like that. Let's go to Doug. Go ahead, Doug.
Yes, I finally figured out how to raise my hand. So. This is not contradicting, I don't think, most of what's been said, but I don't believe I've heard the word value used in this conversation. And that's kind of the way, in my experience, I think most people have a need to feel valued by others and to feel that whatever it is they're doing is valuable to others, which are related but not identical concepts. And what Erez said about the clans, I mean, I know it's true from being in a family, most of us do. Bethany referred to this as well, that we'll do things for our family and we feel valued and we have a strong emotional, personal connection with those people. So that being valued is sufficient to reward whatever it is we're doing. And I'm sure with clans, it was similar, that you were part of a clan. I've heard of the Shakers, for example, or even the Amish, having that same sense of community, of knowing what's expected of them, knowing they're meeting the expectations, having the immediate appreciation of those around us. And in those situations, you don't need money. On the other hand, it's my belief that when, as Alex said, we went to larger societies where we don't have that personal relationship with the people we're doing our work for, that money, of course, it meets our basic requirements. And if you're barely having enough to eat, that's all you're going to worry about. But as you have enough to eat, then I think money is a tangible, real evidence that what you're doing is valued and what you're doing is valuable to others. And it's very hard, even with charity, even to go to a soup kitchen or something and have people thank you for what you're doing. Or in my case, go and sing for a veterans home and have them thank me. That's all very nice, but I would never do that with the kind of intensity that I do my work, because it doesn't have that level of reward. It's not just the practical benefit. It's also, there's something very tangible and a very unavoidable statement that the universe is making back to you when you get paid for something, that it must have been valuable or they wouldn't have paid you to do it. So that's the biggest thing. I also had a couple of smaller comments. Bethany, I think it's interesting, the clip you picked about Downton Abbey, because actually he says in there, don't you know I'm going to involve you in the estate? The estate is essentially a large business. And so really they're looking down on paid wages, but not on being the operator of a business, which is what they are. So it's not that he's not going to work, it's just the type of work he's going to do is what they're talking about. Also, if you look in general, and I haven't done a huge study of this, but my impression is people that had that kind of wealth in the past, the vast majority did fritter it away. They partied and just, there's debauchery oftentimes. They didn't go out and do really valuable things. And those were people who had the access to the education, to the culture, to all of the tools that would have enabled them to do valuable things. And there were clearly examples of people who went out and did that. But if you look across the board, an awful lot of them didn't either. And also, Erez, this is a very small side comment, but one of the people you were citing was struggling to describe why what I learned as the Protestant work ethic, why that took off with such gusto. And it's my experience that people living today have a very hard time projecting themselves back into the time. And in fact, over most of those centuries that you're talking about, the average people really, really did believe in God fervently. They were deeply religious. They really, really believed it. And so when the church said, do this, and it's a sign that you're one of the chosen ones of God, they did it. It wasn't just for esteem. It wasn't just because the people around me will esteem me. It's because they really believe. It's also because they really believed that there was a God and that God was very real to them, if you see what I mean. So anyway, I'm just at least you didn't mention it. The guy maybe seems to have left that out, which is
Yeah, so a question we can ask is, why did they believe in God? Why was the church so powerful? Why did work become so much more central to religion? Why was it that God wanted you to work? Why was it useful to create this association between work and God? And are these things, to what extent are these things still true? Was it useful for them to be true? Is it still useful for them to be true today? That kind of thing. Go ahead, Erez.
You basically made my point for me. I think the distinction here is what we would call between approximate explanation and ultimate explanation. Approximate explanation is the thing that's going through people's minds. And so I believe in God. God told me to do this thing. Oh boy, I better do it. God's pretty powerful, and he has ways of making my life not so great if I don't do what he says I'm supposed to do. The question that the way Henrik would look at this is not at that level, but rather, well, why would that be a compelling thing starting in 1600, but wasn't compelling before that? So where did that belief come from? Why did it take hold? Why did it stick? And Henrik does sort of point out that it had started taking hold by the 1300s. You have movements all over that are starting to associate work with godliness. You have the Cistercians within the Catholic Church who promote those kinds of hardworking ethics. And so it's not just the Protestants that have it. And then the Protestants adopt it, and they help to spread it very strongly. And by the way, yes, to answer Alex's question, there are lasting effects still today. So he does document that as well. Just kind of an interesting fact.
Yeah, and another interesting thing you brought up, Doug, is the idea that being paid shows that you're being valued for what you contribute. And we can ask the question, to what extent is that true? To what extent are people being paid kind of commensurate to the value they contribute? Because if we just imagine a labor market kind of doing its thing and working itself out, employers would only pay people enough to provide an incentive for them to do the work. So that's going to respond to a lot of different factors. And obviously, there's some work in society that people just do for free without being paid. That's incredibly valuable. So there's more to it than just recognizing the value that someone's contributing to society. On the other hand, before, when I was talking about this hybrid between the large scale and the small scale, so if you're a family and you're bringing home a large amount of money, the value you're contributing to your family is very large. So in that case, the amount of money you bring in is directly mapped on to the value you contribute to your family that you earned by going out into the market. Let's go.
Oh, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
There were a few other things I wanted to say, just because my dad, that's my dad, Doug. he had a few different interesting points there. So yeah, in terms of the value, I do think you could put it forth as an alternative hypothesis. So I just want to spell this out a little bit. Like, we were talking about money as something that the primary point in terms of what's motivating us unconsciously is that it's bringing us resources, and then consciously we come to value it for other reasons. I think the way I would spell out my dad's maybe alternative would be that we evolved maybe even genetically to respond to being socially valued by other people as sort of a blanket thing, and money has become a signal that that's happening. That's how I would think about it as an alternative, as opposed to maybe just consistent, like you said, with what I was already saying. And I think that is an interesting alternative. I think it might operate to some extent, but I also think that there are issues with it, like what Alex brought up. And some of these are even issues that people bring up and get kind of confused about or concerned about in the general discussion around payment, because people notice that oh wait, teachers, we kind of know, we have an intuition they're contributing a lot, but they don't actually get paid that much. Or volunteers, wait, they're contributing. Or oh, what about women, or men who are home with their kids and then they don't get paid. So we kind of know that on the one hand, obviously there's some degree to which if you're doing something totally useless to society, you might not get paid anything for it. And if you're doing more useful stuff, you get paid. They're certainly not perfectly correlated or one-to-one, and we do recognize that, and maybe the fact that people are upset about it suggests that some of what my dad is talking about is going on, where people sort of see money as a signal of value, but it doesn't totally work like that, because it also responds to supply and demand and all sorts of labor and all sorts of other factors. You could be a defense attorney for criminals, and even personally, subjectively in your own mind, you might make a lot of money but start to feel like that money is not really reflective of the value that you're doing, or vice versa. So yeah, I think it's comes apart in some ways. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the frittering time away thing. So I just wanted to emphasize again that there are kind of like two different things we could be discussing in terms of what are people going to do spontaneously. One point is like, how much do we need to pay them to do things versus will they do useful things spontaneously? But another, and I think, that so we don't necessarily know that, and as we've talked about, that might affect the level of the basic income. But another factor is like, if we don't need people to do things, are they going to be unhappy? I think that's like a separate point. And so in that sense, like frittering away your time, like if we're just worried about people's happiness and we don't actually want them to do anything, and maybe even employing them would be like more wasteful of resources, then maybe we don't care if they like sit around and do nothing. So it depends on which question you're asking, I think. Kind of like, are you asking like, how can we afford to give people a ton of basic income or not? And like, what are they going to do? Do we need to like force people? Do we need to pay people to get them to do useful things? That's one question. But if we're asking like, what happens when we don't need people's work? Let's imagine robots can do almost everything. Are they going to be okay? That's a different question. And I guess just the last point though I would make is like, it's interesting also that I often think about that from a different perspective, which is like a lot of people may have frittered away their time, but some people like Darwin came up with really, really useful things. So there's always opportunity cost to taking people's time away, even if the vast majority of them don't seem to be doing something productive. And that always needs to be weighed against maybe something else that you might really need done in society or need those people's time for. So a lot of the great science came out of the aristocracy as well, even if it might not have been the vast majority of people, that can still have an outsized impact on the rest of us. So there's going to maybe different ways to frame the people having that kind of leisure time. Yeah. Sorry, well, a lot of comments there, but.
Yeah, great points. Let's go to Richard. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I'm currently watching the show Supernatural, and for Sam and Jean Winchester to do their job, they have to do a bunch of, typically considered bad things, like desecrating graves, credit card fraud to fund their, livelihood, the gambling at pool and things like that. They have to also to actually do their job. They need to use fake IDs to gain access to the information they need, like the coroner's office, or examine the crime scene or something, and they can't get any sort of recognition for what they do, no matter how good it is, because people would consider them insane or something like that. And they, even if they need help for like psychiatrists or something like that, they would be put away. And
yes. So to kind of generalize this point, it's possible to do things that are good and that benefit society that maybe violate the norms of your culture. I maybe sat around playing video games a lot, and people maybe judged me for that. I don't think anyone really judged me all that much. But we judge people for spending their time in certain ways, and you actually don't know what's going to come out of how people spend their time. You don't know why they're spending their time that way. You don't know, what inspiration is going to strike them, that kind of thing. So this kind of speaks to Bethany's point about opportunity cost. If we have norms in our culture or structures in our economy that force people to spend their time in certain ways, there's something we're giving up. We're giving up what they would otherwise be doing with their time. And sometimes that's worth it, and sometimes maybe it's not. I don't know if either of you wants to respond to that.
No, I think that makes sense. Yeah, and I guess all I would say is like there are probabilities, right? So like sometimes if someone's spending their time murdering, we're pretty sure like we'd rather not have spend. So there's like, I mean, the way you frame it is like maybe a little more open-ended than I would frame it. Like we can definitely like have a sense that some people could be spending their time most likely more productively towards what maybe we personally value or want to have happen relative to other people. It also is true though, like you don't know for sure, but that doesn't mean you don't have a guess or an estimate. And I think part of what's maybe in your head, Alex, is like, what if you like really don't need them to do anything else? Like, should you uselessly employ them? Well, then like any possibility of something useful is better than a definite not useful, right? Like if you're making them do something pointless, like the equivalent of like digging holes and filling them back in again, you kind of know anything else except like murdering or harmful things would be, better than that. But in a lot of cases we might be more unclear, and we can probably have some guess. Like with video games, maybe if somebody doesn't think things usually come out of that are good, they might say like, yeah, okay, one person could like discover a lot of bugs in the game and like get into coding and do a lot of cool stuff. Like, I don't know, that's kind of vaguely your story, Alex, but like maybe it's not very probable. So we might have data that suggests that like that's not that likely. So I just add those bounds on it. That's all.
Yeah, and I think Chance, are you a professional video game player or something?
Yeah, I was. I mean, like 6 years ago. Yeah.
Nice. All right, let's go to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, earlier, Bethany, you talked about how if you had a calibrated basic income, that people's like a natural propensity to work, how lazy are people? Like those questions would affect kind of our judgment of how much basic income we can afford to give out. There's another way of looking at that, though, which is that the cultural incentives and the norms that we adopt about work and about life in the economy. That is it possible that also can affect the basic income? I mean, as an example, like there seems to be two basic different ways of expressing this value of work that we've been talking about in this discussion. One of them is like, okay, people need to feel valued by other people. They need to feel like they're going out and contributing. And so in order to sort of like meet that need, we have to give them jobs or make sure they can be employed. But at the beginning of your talk, you put up a slide that had a very, very different way of valuing work, where it says like, be better than the other guy, get up early, go work harder than someone else, right? You hear that a lot, and we all don't hear it in the circles we're in, but there's large parts of culture that are devoted to that kind of messaging, which is more competitive, more like, it doesn't matter how many jobs are available, like how hard are you willing to go out and do that? It strikes me that, that kind of encouraging people to go work, totally irrespective from like economically how many jobs are available, is not necessarily a bad thing or an unhealthy thing in a basic income economy, right? Is it possible that this kind of cultural value of work could actually have a positive role in a world where that's part of what's pushing up the prosperity for everyone else?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that you exactly are the way you're thinking about it, the way I would think about it, which is like, these are additional forms of motivation besides payment. So there's monetary payment as a motivation to work, but there's also potentially like social incentives or things that we've internalized that are just sticking around now, that even though we don't need them anymore. Like we've talked about this cultural trend that Erez has been mentioning, like maybe in a culture that didn't have an internalized sense of work as valuable or productivity, or even like a sense of paying attention to time, you'd have less prosperity, and like you could afford a much lower basic income. But to be more precise, sort of to what you're saying, if you have other motivations to work, it does seem like then payment might have to be less. And so the basic income for everybody else could be more, right? And sort of the extreme example of this would be like people are willing to work for free a lot to show off things about themselves, for example, or because they get other kinds of social rewards. So you could imagine that like, maybe people still want to marry really hardworking people because that means they'll work harder like at home and with the kids and stuff like that. And so people go out and like work hard at things to just show that they're really hardworking, and then like other people want to date them, things like that. That could be a motivation independent of money. And the more you have that kind of thing, as you're talking about, Derek, the more you can afford to pay people more and everybody more with basic income, because you're not as you can afford that because the work's happening anyway, without withholding some basic income to pay people. So I think we don't really know how that would pan out, because right now, to some extent, most people need paid work. They need to get money, right? So you don't know for sure how much people would work just for like status or other like showing things off or other kinds of things, if they didn't need to devote their time to paid work. But yeah, I think that answers your question. But yeah, basically I'm agreeing with your framing there, I think. Yeah. E, did you want to say anything about that question?
No, I agree. And I like the examples that you gave that have come up till this point also.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. People's behavior is going to be a product of incentives, and money is just one of those incentives. So people could be naturally, intrinsically, like genetically lazy, and that lowers the amount of basic income we can afford. But also, if the cultural incentives are such that they promote people just kind of not doing anything useful, that might lower the level of basic income we can afford. And the vice versa too. If people are intrinsically motivated, or if we have lots of cultural norms about people doing awesome things that help society, then maybe that boosts the amount of money the economy can handle being spent into it.
Yeah, I think
I will add that one risk here is that you start to think, Well, all we need to do is to make the things that we need prestigious, and so people will provide them. And I think it's a little bit of I think we should not assume that as a society, whatever that is, that we can control that so well. And you may find yourself hoping to be able to control that and not being able to. It seems to be, to some extent, a process that sort of happens on its own.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, as someone who studies like ineffective altruism, obviously it's good and that people are socially motivated to be altruistic to a fairly large extent, but it also is the case that these dynamics of social incentives can be somewhat inefficient, or like they don't always lead to the things that have the best impact for various reasons. It can be hard to have that happen. So that can be a role for other kind. You might need government or something else to step in and provide those needs rather than social incentives. It doesn't always work out perfectly, just as a specific example. So for example, things that aren't easily observable, it's hard to get those to be socially enforced, or things that show off the traits that you want to show off to potential dating partners might not be the same things that are most needed for society. Like maybe it's, like I said, skateboarding, and people don't really need people to be great at skateboarding, but like that's what people get really into because it shows off like physical fitness and work ethic and like a whole bunch of other things. And so you have a bunch of people like, spending 10,000 hours getting great at skateboarding, that's what they'll do spontaneously. And I think we circle back around then to money too as a great. No, none of us, I don't think, are saying that we don't need money in this kind of economy that we have to motivate people to do things that need to get done. I like the way Alex puts it, like money is to incentivize people to do something different from what they would do before. And to some extent, social incentives might help pick up the slack, or like might mean that we need money less. But I think, as Erez points out, like we're definitely still going to need it. People are not naturally spontaneously going to just do like all the things that we need. That it's too complex, let alone whether people would naturally gravitate towards it. So it's really just a matter of degree here. I think, degree in terms of automation and other factors, and then degree in terms of social incentives too. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to not live in a large-scale economy where we need to pay people to do things. So the question is, how much do we need to pay them to get the incentives right, that the economy can do the maximum of what it needs to do to benefit people, that kind of thing. Go ahead, Chance, if you're there.
Yeah, I was just turning around to look at my bookshelf because, earlier we were talking about, the question of like, how do we explain why the Catholic Church started taking on this role of trying to individuate people and drive them into the workforce and stuff like that as independent laborers. And I mentioned in the chat that like maybe clans worked more like unions as compared with independent contractors. And so industrialists, elites, clergy, which usually flow in the same circles, were motivated to undermine the power of clans. And this may not be like, again, a power grab per se, but more like, look at all this wealth that's available. I mean, you hear Locke, like John Locke, just frothing at the mouth when he's talking about the Americas. He's just like, wow, there's so much land over there. Oh my gosh, all the stuff we could do with that. If only they weren't savages, And Ellen Wood talks about this a lot in her book, Liberty and Property. So that's a good resource for that. But then I had another point related to Bethany's dad. He seemed to almost like be bordering dangerously close to endorsing the market justice myth. And, I'm convinced by David Graeber, Stephen Pearlstein, and my own experience that there's no such thing as market justice. Being paid is no guarantee of positive value being generated in society. And we can see this pretty obviously when we think about drug addiction, prostitution, whatever your stance is on that. Selling shark or dolphin meat, lots of things that you get that obviously produce value, but aren't the kind of value that necessarily we want in society. So, and then furthermore, there's no macroeconomic mechanism to empower labor to bargain for the value of their own labor, as far as I can tell. But basic income would kind of, and if this is, I'm understanding like the way Alex is coming at this sometimes, it seems like this would be a basic income would provide a macroeconomic mechanism to sort of actually calibrate labor demand or labor supply in accurately. And so, yeah. And then, in our economy, laborers simply have to take whatever the holders of capital offer them. And automation is a real problem here because the value of human labor to do necessary tasks in society is set to decrease over time and perhaps dramatically. And so those are the points I wanted to make there.
Chance, can you just bring up your first point again? I got thinking about your second point, and I just, or maybe Erez, do you remember it?
Yeah, so the point is that the Klan was operating a bit like a union. I think that's roughly the right intuition, though I will quibble with the fact that you name industrialists. We're predating the Industrial Revolution by 1,000 years, and so we cannot talk about them quite yet. But basically what you had was fairly powerful units that were good at keeping resources within them. And the church wanted those resources, and it finally found a way to get at it. And the way was to make it so that it was evil to marry your cousin, which made it much harder to keep resources within the clan. And not just cousin, but cousin, second cousin, all the way through sixth cousin for a good chunk of the Middle Ages was you weren't allowed, which meant that you had to move out of your town effectively to marry. You had to go to neighboring towns to find somebody who wasn't related to you six removed. So that was what the church was doing. Of your questions, that was the one that I felt like I really knew the response to.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and in terms of the I think you called it like the justice theory of value or something like that. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to me that people bring this up so much though, and like they either
market theory of justice.
Market theory of justice. They either feel that it should be that way, or that it is that way, or maybe, yeah, if not that it is, that it should be somehow. And so it makes me think that like part of what's going on might be that that's like one of the many signals, right? So like as you pointed out, like if someone's buying dolphin meat, like, well, if you're giving somebody happiness, I guess, like that person who really wants that dolphin meat. It's just that in aggregate, like we might feel that the pros don't outweigh the cons. And there are many different factors that affect the cost of your labor besides social value. Like maybe there are 1,000 children whose lives you could save, but they only have $1 each. And so you get $1,000 for saving 1,000 children's lives. But maybe there's like one gazillionaire, for whatever reason, he has a ton of money, and he wants to pay you, $5,000 to sharpen his pencil so they can be sharp, because it doesn't mean anything to him. So it's money. So like, that's just one more example of how like these things. So like you are providing happiness to the pencil sharpener, and you are providing happiness to those kids, but the dollar per utility isn't lining up. I think we all kind of understand that, but my point is that maybe because it's one signal in the mix, like that might still be important to people personally, which I also think was my dad's point. So like in terms of people's motivation, the fact that the money could be a signal of providing value might still be right. And that might explain partly why people get so frustrated that these things are not lining up, as opposed to just kind of accepting it, because they're seeing it as a signal possibly, and then it's not a signal that's a very good signal. And so then people get frustrated with that. So that's one thing that I was thinking about in response to my dad's comments too.
Yeah, good stuff. Let's go to Eddie. Go ahead, Eddie.
I want to kind of say that we should be careful to keep in mind that the price of labor, it's an allocation mechanism. It's not a enabling mechanism. A lot of these, including the article, but there's a lot of arguments that go out about you can't have basic income, because if you had a basic income, then people would not be motivated to work. And I want to say that is a problem that is already solved. It's not actually a problem because, say people are very lazy and they really don't want to work. What that does is just shift the entire supply curve, in one direction, but it doesn't mean that the economy cannot get the labor that it needs. It just means that the economy will deal with that shortage of labor by bringing the price up until it has all of the labor that it needs. So it's not a problem. And in a calibrated basic income world, where you're using the basic income to make sure that the economy is actually fully activated. We're actually using the productive resources that we have, which is not the case right now. In that world, if people were more lazy or less lazy due to cultural factors or whatever, that would only just shift your economy between being one that produces more material goods and services, or being one that produces less material goods and services, but allows people to have more leisure time, which people also value and should value, and is also valuable thing in itself.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think those are good points. I just wanted to point out one thing that I'm sure Alex is also thinking, which is like, if labor becomes more expensive across the entire economy, that will create inflation, which will kind of could counteract to some extent the quantity of the basic income. So if it happens in certain sectors and it's balanced out by other sectors being, maybe going in the opposite direction, that's not going to be an issue. But you can't push the, well, yeah, if you have wages needing to go up across the whole economy, you'll have inflation.
Yeah, if the supply of labor is too low, you can decrease the basic income to increase the supply of labor, and then that also brings up the price of labor as well, because consumers are getting less of their money through the basic income and more of their money through wages. Let's go to Austin. Go ahead, Austin.
Hey guys, first of all, this is a great discussion. And there's like so many thousands of like each little part of it. I feel like we could expand out to a whole 2 hours, but so forgive me if I've got a few sort of overlapping points here. First of all, I wanted to go back to this idea of when we were talking about clocks and time. And one of the things there's a line in this song that goes move to the analog timepiece sky-wide. Right, like so, it's about that. The people responded to natural rhythms, to like actual tides and stuff like that. And in a very technologically simple or fundamental society, I don't like the word primitive, but a society without a lot of technology, you don't control the environment, so you have to respond to it. Right, so you pick fruit when the tree is when the fruit's ripe. And you hunt when the animals are near the water hole, and you respond to all of these external factors. So who cares if it's 9 o'clock, right? Like, it doesn't matter. So there was a study I saw about, it was called The Pace of Life. And it said people who live in northern latitudes, one of the things was being Protestant or Catholic, and the other thing was living in northern latitudes or closer to the equator, because you have the external time, the shorter days and longer days, and these changes with the seasons are greater. So it sort of affects these people, the way people respond to time. But I think like what I was getting to with that is like, there's a reason for laziness. Laziness makes sense in certain contexts. Like if there's no fruit to pick, there's no point climbing the tree. Right, you know what I mean? Like, you save your energy in an environment where calories are scarce, or where you need to have your energy when you need it, and you need to sort of store it up and not use it when you don't. And so there's like reasons that laziness is actually the effective strategy in those contexts as well, I think. But anyhow, but I wanted to also go about with jobs. People talking about jobs, like the reason I don't have a job is because all the jobs I've had, I felt like the opportunity cost was too high. Right. Like, I mean, if I could get a job at a cafe somewhere, and it's like, not only do I not think that they need me at that cafe, I don't think they need to have that cafe in this town. And like, there's just all the stuff I can do outside of the labor market actually, to me, has a greater payoff. And because I'm able to survive outside the labor market. Right. But what I wanted to say is that one of the things about a UBI is it would actually help align those labor market incentives with value, I think, to a greater extent. Because we have this situation that Alex talks about a lot, where the financial sector is overblown and unstable, and a lot of the economic incentives are about doing stuff that people closer to in or close to the financial sector want, rather than doing stuff that people in general want. So I still think you've got to worry about inequality after you provide everyone with a basic income. You still got to worry about inequality, because otherwise some people's needs will be massively overrepresented, and the system won't distribute work in a very, I don't think you can make it perfectly just, but I think you can make it more just. Last thing I wanted to say, was the idea of disinterest, right? And so like what's happened, one of the things that I think is really interesting is the professionalization of knowledge and thought. So now, right, like it doesn't like, to an extent, there's going to be a population of people who don't take, say, for example, Alex very seriously as an economist because he doesn't have a job at a university or a think tank, or because he's not validated by
or a degree
somewhere. or a degree, right? Well, I mean, I would say there's more to the degree than the job, right? Like there's more, like I'm less hostile to degrees conferring legitimacy than I am to employment conferring legitimacy, right? Because it's actually a reversal of the historic norm where there used to be this value of disinterest. Like I am a disinterested party, therefore my opinion on the situation is more valid. Whereas now, and you actually see this in like political discussions, it's the opposite. If you say, if I say, oh, well, my opinion on, I don't know, something that doesn't affect me, if I start talking about racism, right, people will say, well, you're not affected, you're not a victim of racism, so your opinion doesn't matter. And it's like, I get that obviously we have to listen to the people who are involved and who are experiencing it, but the idea that an external objective opinion, a disinterested opinion is invalid is actually quite a novel norm, right? Like it used to be the case that, so like having Cicero, I think it was, famously criticized historians who did it, or someone criticized historians who did it for money, because you're going to produce the history that is going to get you paid, not the history that's necessarily true. And, like philosophy used to be considered disinterested, and you weren't, having a job doing it made actually your output suspect. And we've kind of got this reversal of that now, where having a job and being paid to produce and having institutional validation actually elevates thought and knowledge. And I'm not saying one approach is necessarily right and one approach is necessarily wrong, but it's a really interesting way that the sort of labor market has colonized a lot of stuff. And I think if we had a more disinterested, if we had a more of a sense of play. So the example that I've heard used is these religious scholars in Israel who get like a subsistence amount of money. And all they do all day is study religious texts, right? And they actually report having a very high life quality and life satisfaction. And they're sort of held in high status, even though it's this sort of, they're essentially living on welfare, doing play, right? But that's kind of the model of intellectual engagement I can imagine you'd see more in a basic income world. And I think that would be really fruitful.
Yeah, in some contexts, if you're getting paid, that means you're an expert. And then in other contexts, if you're getting paid, that means you're a sellout or something like that. So that's something interesting to pay attention to, too. We are getting towards the end, and I do have a final question I want to ask you guys. But do either of you want to respond to anything Austin said real quick?
Well, I know we're running out of time, so I think we can just go to your...
Okay, so I wanted to mention that especially during coronavirus times, the policy talk has been about supporting workers and protecting wages and jobs. And, the word stimulus keeps coming up as if we somehow need to get the economy going or something like that. And the question is, why didn't we just say, we don't want people to work right now, or at least we want to minimize that. We want them to stay home and hand them the money so they can still access the economic output that we can still produce when our economy is in our kind of semi-hibernating state. So kind of the generalization of that question is, when are we collectively getting cultural incentives wrong, and what can we do about it? So go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think the local incentives for the politicians are to not look like they're trying to support like free riding or something like that. And I think behind that is a belief that this work is generally going to all be needed in the future. And so this is very much like a temporary thing. And these people really, really want to do the work, which is part of the cultural incentives we're talking about, but they just can't right now. That's why we're still calling them workers and things like that. And so I think that was an important optic for people. So I think with coronavirus, there's kind of a short-term versus a long-term distinction. So you might believe that really everybody's work was incredibly productive and useful, at least we would like it before coronavirus. And right now we just need to pay people to stay home, which I have heard those terms used, like we need to pay people to stay home right now. And then we want them to come back to those jobs later. So I actually think that's a little bit separable from the bigger picture question of, was all of that work useful and worth the cost before the coronavirus, which is really the question for what we should think about in terms of the general cultural incentives and how much we want to be emphasizing work. I guess what I would say is there's sort of an assumption that the economy works such that useless work isn't happening, or at least I think that's a largely shared assumption, not in this group, but in general. And I think changing that assumption creates a different framework that could actually be socially costly to keep some people employed is a perspective that many people don't have. And so instead, the idea is that if you're working, you're doing something good for people. And so the social incentives are kind of behind that. And so I guess the question is to you and recognize that might be wrong. requires actually something about thinking about the economy. It requires a certain view of the economy and whether that work is actually costly or not costly. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is I like your point about sort of small scale versus large scale. And in the smaller scale, it's kind of easier to understand whether people are contributing something useful or not. We don't really run into this problem as much. Like if someone in our family is doing something like, taking out the trash or whatever, we kind of have a big sense, or if they're, taking out the trash and it was too early to take out the trash, we kind of know if it was useless or useful or whatever. It's like easier to solve.
Or if they're bringing home a paycheck.
Yeah, but I guess what I was trying to say is it's like easier to gauge the value of contributions usually in a smaller scale, but like in a very large scale, it's more difficult to gauge the value of contributions. And I think that's one of the problems that we're running into, and one of the things that needs to be solved. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Erez.
I don't have a lot to add on this point because I found it to be completely bizarre. When the key thing that you need is for people to stay home, the obvious thing that you do is you pay them to stay home. And so you just implement a universal basic income. Done.
Yeah, there you go.
So I was quite puzzled by that. And I think Bethany's response probably is the right one, is that there's this like overarching perspective on work as being essential that was sort of bled over into this situation when the natural thing to have done would have been to implement the UBI, and that other places to do when they had the means to do it. So
I guess more broadly, we can ask about even like as Bethany was alluding to, outside of coronavirus times, we still expect people to work. And when there's a problem, like when wages aren't enough for consumers to get everything, we do all these things that interfere or distort the labor market away from what it would do otherwise.
So I think the Chance is pointing out that Chance, I have all my meetings in the kitchen for this reason. I like to cook, but I think the thing to note there is that like there seems to be there's probably, at least the thing that I always think of when I think about why do we emphasize work is probably because we don't really want to do transfers of wealth in this country. And that I've always assumed that it's related to that, but I might be wrong. Or maybe that's just one factor, and there's dozens of others. Obviously, there's the historical factors related to Protestantism that are also important, and the ascendancy of Protestantism in the United States and its dominance culturally. But I think that there's also this issue of sort of an elite keeping the money within its pockets.
Okay, so maybe that creates a window for some of the stuff that I like to talk about, where you don't necessarily need to take money away from the rich in order to make all this work. So that's it. This is a great discussion, you guys. Thank you, Bethany and Erez, for coming on as featured guests. This was our last one for 2020. We're going to be coming back in 2021 with a new format. We're going to be cutting it down to an hour, and Derek is going to be co-hosting with me, and we're going to try to get more featured guests and have more discussions like this one more often. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex. This is really fun. Thanks everyone for your questions and thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.